It took me more than 50 years to understand something I'm about to tell you in the next 10 minutes. My own life was never really mine. I didn't realize it at first, of course. At 72, you don't wake up one morning and suddenly question everything you've built. You hold on to routine. You make your coffee the same way, 2 teaspoons of sugar, a splash of half and half. You sit at the same kitchen table, the one your husband bought 40 years ago, and you tell yourself that everything is exactly as it should be. But that morning felt different. Not louder, not dramatic, just quieter in a way that made my chest feel tight. I was staring at a bank envelope I didn't recognize. My name was printed on it, Margaret Wilson, but the return address wasn't my bank. It wasn't any bank I had ever used. I turned it over in my hands, slow, careful, like it might explain itself if I gave it enough time. I remember thinking, maybe it's just a mistake. At my age, you start to assume confusion belongs to you, not the world around you. I opened it anyway. Inside was a statement. Numbers. Transactions. Balances that didn't make sense. Not because they were small, but because they were larger than anything I had ever seen connected to my name. I read it once. Then again. Then I set it down and stared at the wall for a long time, the way you do when something doesn't fit into the life you thought you understood. Because here's the thing no one tells you about getting older. It's not the aches or the forgetfulness that unsettles you. It's the moment you realize there are things happening around you that you were never meant to see. My son Daniel always told me not to worry about finances. "Mom, you've done enough," he would say, smiling the same way he did when he was 10 years old asking for permission to stay up late. "Olivia handles everything now. You should just enjoy your life." And I believed him. Of course I did. I raised him to be honest. I taught him to look people in the eye when he spoke. I trusted him the way only a mother can, without question, without hesitation. And Olivia, she was always so composed, so organized. The kind of woman who labeled pantry shelves and planned meals a week in advance. She spoke gently, but there was always something underneath it. Something I couldn't name at the time. I used to think it was confidence. Now I know it was control. That envelope sat on my table for hours. I didn't call anyone. I didn't panic. I just sat there, remembering small things that never felt important before. The way Olivia would answer questions that weren't directed at her. The way Daniel would glance at her before responding to me, as if checking for approval. The way I had slowly stopped being part of conversations in my own home. Not suddenly. Not obviously. Just gradually. Like a chair being pulled away inch by inch until one day, you realize you're no longer at the table. I picked up the statement again and looked closer. Transfers I didn't authorize. Accounts I didn't recognize. And yet, everything was under my name. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder than that. Clarity. Because for the first time in decades, I asked myself a question I had never thought to ask before. If this is my name, then why does none of it feel like my life? I folded the paper carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and set it beside my coffee cup. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. On the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, something had already begun to move. I didn't know the full truth yet. Not even close. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had spent more than 50 years trusting the wrong people with the right things. And I was done not knowing. The house was quiet that afternoon in a way I had never noticed before. Not empty, not lonely, just controlled, like every sound had its place and every movement had already been decided long before I made it. And I realized that even my own routine felt borrowed, like I was living inside a schedule that someone else had written for me. I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to, staring at the same envelope I had already read 3 times, trying to convince myself that there had to be a simple explanation, something small, something harmless, but the longer I looked at those numbers, the more I understood. That nothing about it was accidental. It was precise, organized, intentional, the way Olivia organized everything. I thought about the last few years, about how slowly things had changed, how gently I had been moved out of decisions that used to belong to me. It started with little things, Daniel offering to handle the bills because he said it would make my life easier, Olivia setting up automatic payments so I would not have to worry about due dates. They framed it as care, as support, as kindness, and I accepted it because that is what mothers do. We accept help when it comes from our children because we believe it is love. I remember the first time I asked about one of my accounts. It had been a simple question, nothing serious. Just curiosity, and Olivia had answered before Daniel even had the chance, her voice calm, reassuring, "Everything is taken care of, Margaret. You do not need to concern yourself with that anymore." And I had nodded, even smiled, as if that was exactly what I wanted, as if being removed from my own life was a gift. I did not see it then. I did not want to see it, because seeing it would have meant admitting that something was wrong, and when you have spent decades building a family, the last thing you want to believe is that the foundation is shifting beneath your feet. I walked into the living room and looked around at the photographs on the wall. Daniel as a child with a missing front tooth. Daniel graduating high school. Daniel standing next to Olivia on their wedding day, smiling in a way that used to make me feel proud. I tried to find the moment where things had changed, the exact point where my role had been rewritten without me noticing, but it was not a single moment. It was a series of quiet adjustments, small decisions that added up to something much larger, the Sunday dinners that became less frequent, the conversations that became shorter, the way Daniel stopped asking for my opinion and started informing me of decisions that had already been made. I told myself it was normal, that children grow up and create their own lives, that mothers step back and make room, but stepping back is not the same as being pushed aside, and that was the difference I had missed. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my finger hovering over Daniel's name. I could call him, I could ask directly, I could demand an explanation, but something inside me held me back, something steady and deliberate. Because I understood now that asking questions would only give them time to prepare answers, and whatever this was, it had been happening for too long to be explained away in a single conversation. I needed to see it clearly, all of it, without interruption, without their version of the truth shaping what I understood. I set the phone down and went back to the table, folding the statement again with careful precision, the same way I used to fold Daniel's school papers when he was a boy, neat, organized, controlled. I placed it back into the envelope and slid it into my purse, not because I was afraid of losing it, but because I knew I would need it, that this piece of paper was not just a mistake or a misunderstanding, it was a door, and for the first time in a very long time, I was ready to open it myself, without asking permission, without waiting for someone else to tell me what was behind it, because whatever I was about to find, it belonged to me. And I was no longer willing to live in a life that I did not understand. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind refused to stay quiet. The envelope was still in my purse, resting on the chair beside my bed like it had been waiting for me all night. I sat there for a moment before reaching for it, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a kind of calm I had not felt in years. I dressed carefully, the same way I used to when Daniel was young, and I had to be everywhere at once. Neat blouse, comfortable shoes, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything out of the ordinary. Because the truth is, the most powerful thing about that morning was how ordinary it looked from the outside. I made my coffee, but I did not drink it. I left it on the counter untouched, grabbed my purse, and walked out the door without saying a word to anyone. The drive to the bank took 15 minutes, the same route I had taken countless times before, past the grocery store, the gas station, the small park where I used to bring Daniel when he was a boy. Everything looked familiar, and yet it felt different, like I was seeing it from a distance for the first time, as if I had been living inside a version of my life that someone else had edited. When I pulled into the parking lot, I sat in the car for a moment, watching people come and go, wondering how many of them truly knew what was happening in their own lives, or if they were, like me, simply trusting that things were as they appeared. I stepped inside and was greeted by the quiet hum of routine, the soft clicking of keyboards, the low voices of conversations that had nothing to do with me. I approached the front desk and gave my name, my voice steady, my hands calm. I would like to review all accounts under my name, I said. The woman behind the counter smiled politely and asked for identification. I handed it over without hesitation, a small, simple gesture that carried more weight than I could explain, because for the first time in a long time, I was asking for something that belonged to me. She typed for a moment, her expression neutral, professional, and then something shifted, not dramatically, just a slight pause, a flicker of surprise that she quickly tried to hide. "Ma'am, would you mind waiting a moment?" she said, her tone still polite but more careful now. I nodded and took a seat, folding my hands in my lap the way I had done so many times before in situations where patience was expected. Minutes passed slowly, but I did not feel restless. I felt focused. Like every second was moving me closer to something I had ignored for too long. Eventually, another woman approached me, older, composed, with the kind of presence that suggested she understood more than she said. "Mrs. Wilson," she began. "I am Linda Carter, the branch manager. I think it would be best if we spoke privately." I followed her into her office, closing the door behind me. The room was quiet, organized, everything in its place. She sat across from me and opened a file, her movements deliberate, respectful. "When was the last time you personally reviewed your accounts?" she asked. I considered the question carefully, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real. "I cannot remember," I said finally, and there was a silence that followed, not uncomfortable, but heavy, like the kind of silence that comes before the truth settles in. Linda nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer, and then she turned the file toward me. What I saw did not shock me the way I thought it would. It did not make me gasp or raise my voice. It simply confirmed what I had already begun to understand. There were multiple accounts, investment portfolios, transfers, balances that told a story I had never been allowed to read, and yet every single one of them carried my name, not Daniel's, not Olivia's, mine. I traced my finger along the page, reading each number carefully, letting it sink in piece by piece. Because this was not confusion. This was not a mistake. This was something that had been built over time, structured, maintained, controlled, and I had been placed outside of it without ever realizing it. I looked up at Linda, my voice calm, clear. "Who has been managing these accounts?" I asked. And she hesitated, just for a moment, before answering. "Authorized access has been granted to Daniel Wilson and Olivia Wilson," she said, and there it was, not hidden, not complicated, just stated plainly, as if it had always been. Obvious, as if I had simply chosen not to see it. I nodded once, slowly, feeling something settle inside me, not anger, not sadness, but certainty, because now I understood the difference between not knowing and choosing not to ask, and I had crossed that line. There was no going back. I closed the file gently and placed my hands on the table, steady, grounded. "I would like to know everything," I said, and for the first time in years, those words did not feel like a request. They felt like a decision. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my phone. I just kept both hands on the wheel and let the silence settle around me, not empty this time, but full of things that had been there all along waiting for me to notice them. I replayed Linda's words in my mind, not the tone, not the hesitation, just the facts: authorized access, Daniel Wilson, Olivia Wilson. It was so simple when you stripped away the years of trust and routine that had hidden it. So clean, so deliberate. I realized then that what hurt the most was not the money, not the accounts, not even the control. It was the understanding that this had not happened overnight. This had been built slowly, carefully, piece by piece, while I was standing right there believing I was still part of everything. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, looking at the house, my house, the one my husband and I had worked for, saved for, built a life inside, and for the first time, it did not feel like it belonged to me. It felt like a place I had been allowed to stay, a place where decisions were made around me instead of with me. I stepped inside quietly, the same way I always did, but now I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. The mail sorted neatly on the counter, already opened, already handled, the calendar on the wall filled in with appointments I had never scheduled, the small, subtle signs of a life that was being managed without my involvement. I walked into the living room and sat down, placing my purse beside me, my movements slow and deliberate, not because I was unsure, but because I was thinking, really thinking for the first time in years. I thought about my husband, about the way he used to handle things, the way he would explain decisions to me, include me, make sure I understood what we had and what it meant. He used to say, "You should always know what belongs to you, Margaret, not because you need to control it, but because it is your life." And I realized how far I had drifted from that simple truth, not because I was incapable, not because I was confused, but because I had trusted the wrong people to hold that responsibility for me. I heard the front door open and close, Daniel's voice carrying from the hallway, familiar, warm, unchanged. "Mom, you home?" he called out, and for a moment, everything inside me wanted to respond the way I always had. With that same easy tone, that same quiet reassurance that everything was fine, but I stayed where I was, listening instead. He walked into the room a few seconds later, stopping when he saw me sitting there. "Hey, I did not know you had gone out this morning," he said. His smile casual, relaxed, the same smile I had trusted my entire life. I nodded slightly, studying his face in a way I never had before, looking for something, anything that would tell me if he understood what he had been part of. "I had an errand," I said simply, my voice even. He glanced at my purse, then back at me, just for a second, and there it was, not guilt exactly, not fear, just awareness, a flicker of something that told me he knew more than he had ever said. "You should have told me, I could have taken care of it for you," he replied, and the words landed differently now, not as kindness, not as support, but as confirmation. I shook my head gently. "It is something I needed to handle myself," I said, and I watched the way he processed that, the slight shift in his posture, the pause before he responded, because that was not the role I had been playing for a long time, handling things myself, asking questions, stepping back into my own life. Olivia appeared in the doorway then, her expression composed as always, her eyes moving quickly between us, assessing, calculating in a way that I could finally see clearly. "Everything all right?" she asked, her tone light but precise. I met her gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not defensive, just present in a way I had not been before. "Yes," I said, "everything is becoming very clear," and for the first time, neither of them had anything to say in response. The room fell quiet, and in that silence, I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Clarity does not need to be loud. It does not need to argue or explain itself. It simply exists, steady and undeniable, and once you have it, you cannot unsee what has been in front of you all along. I did not argue with them that evening. I did not raise my voice or ask questions that would give them time to prepare answers. Instead, I moved through the house the same way I always had, calm, predictable, familiar. But inside, everything had shifted into something sharper, more focused. I watched the way Olivia continued her routine, setting the table, checking her phone, adjusting small details as if nothing had changed. As if I had not just stepped into a space she had carefully controlled for years, and Daniel followed her rhythm without realizing it, responding to her cues, waiting for her to speak before he did. It was subtle, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. It was not partnership, it was alignment, and I was no longer part of it. Dinner was quiet, not tense, not uncomfortable, just quiet in a way that felt measured, as if every word had been chosen in advance. Olivia spoke about groceries, about a neighbor, about things that did not matter, and Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, but neither of them asked me anything, not where I had gone, not what I had done, not what I had learned. And that told me more than any explanation ever could, because if they believed everything was still under control, they would have asked, they would have filled the silence with reassurance, but they did not. They let it sit there, and I let them. I finished my meal slowly, placing my fork down with the same care I had used all my life, and when I stood up, I did not ask for permission. I did not announce my plans. I simply said, "I have some things to take care of tomorrow," and walked away. The next morning, I called. Linda Carter, not as a request, but as a continuation. I would like copies of all documentation related to my accounts, I said, and there was no hesitation in her response this time. Of course, Mrs. Wilson, I will have everything prepared for you. I arrived at the bank just before noon, and this time, I did not sit and wait. I walked in with purpose, with the quiet certainty of someone who understood what she was looking for. Linda handed me a folder, thicker than I expected, organized. Detailed, complete. I sat down in her office and began to read, not quickly, not emotionally, but carefully, line by line, page by page. Transfers authorized years ago, signatures that carried my name, but not my awareness, accounts opened, closed, redirected, all structured in a way that was technically correct, legally sound. But personally hidden, I saw patterns, not random decisions, not isolated actions, but a system, a structure that had been built over time. And I realized something that settled deeply inside me. This was not about a single mistake or a misunderstanding. This was about control, consistent, quiet, intentional control. I looked up at Linda and asked, "When was the first authorization granted?" She flipped through the file and pointed to a date. 8 years ago. I nodded slowly. 8 years. I traced that timeline in my mind, back to when Olivia first moved into our lives, back to when Daniel started saying things like, "Let us make things easier for you." And I understood now that ease had never been the goal, management had. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it, steady, grounded. "I want to remove all authorized access," I said, and Linda met my gaze, not surprised, not hesitant, just respectful. "We can begin that process immediately," she replied, and as she started explaining the steps, the forms, the legal confirmations, I felt something return to me that I had not realized was missing. Not power, not control, but ownership. Ownership of my name, my decisions, my life. I signed the first document with a steady hand, the ink settling onto the page with a quiet finality, and in that moment, I understood that I was not reacting, I was reclaiming. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, and for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. I already knew. I did not tell Daniel or Olivia what I had done at the bank. Not that day, not the next, because I understood something now that I had ignored for far too long. Information has weight, and the moment you release it, you give other people the chance to react, to adjust, to defend themselves, and I was no longer interested in giving them that advantage. Instead, I returned home and continued as if nothing had changed. I made dinner, I set the table, I listened to Olivia talk about schedules and errands, and I watched Daniel move through the house with the same familiar ease. But now I could see the structure behind it, the invisible lines that connected their decisions, the way everything flowed through Olivia before it reached anyone else. I did not interrupt, I did not challenge, I simply observed, and the more I watched, the clearer everything became. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, not out of habit, but out of purpose. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder from the bank in front of me, reading through it again, slower this time, not looking for surprises, but for patterns, for details that would help me understand how everything had been maintained for so long without my awareness. And there it was, a trust account, one I had not noticed at first, buried among the other documents, structured differently, managed separately. I turned the page carefully and read the name attached to it, my name, followed by a designation that made me pause. Primary beneficiary. I sat back slightly, letting that settle in, because if that was true, then the situation was not what I had assumed. I had not been removed from everything. I had been positioned, and someone else had been managing that position without my involvement. I picked up the phone and called Linda again. "I need to understand the trust account," I said, and she responded without hesitation. "That account is connected to a larger estate structure, Mrs. Wilson. It was established by your husband before his passing." I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering him, remembering the way he handled things, the way he always thought ahead, not out of fear, but out of care. "Who currently manages it?" I asked. Even though I already knew the answer, authorized oversight was granted to Daniel Wilson, she said. And there was a brief pause before she added, with administrative access extended to Olivia Wilson. I nodded, even though she could not see me, because that was exactly what I expected. I ended the call and sat there in silence, not shocked, not angry, just aware. Aware that everything I was uncovering was not random, it was consistent with a system that had been built carefully over time, and that system had relied on one assumption, that I would never question it. I looked around the kitchen, at the familiar objects that had been part of my life for decades, and I realized how easily familiarity can become a mask, how quickly routine can turn into something that keeps you from noticing what is actually happening. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the morning light settle over the yard, steady, quiet, unchanged. And I understood that my next steps did not need to be rushed, they needed to be precise, because this was not about confrontation, it was about position, about understanding exactly where I stood before I made any move that could not be undone. I returned to the table and opened the folder again, focusing now on what the trust allowed, what it protected, what it required, and with each line I read, the picture became clearer, not just of what had been done, but of what I could do. I did not need to argue. I did not need to explain. I needed to act, quietly, deliberately, in a way that would shift everything without giving anyone the chance to stop it. And for the first time since I opened that envelope, I felt something steady and certain settle into place, not doubt, not confusion, but direction, because I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was preparing for what would happen next. By the third day, I did not need to look at the documents anymore to understand what had been happening. I could see it in the way Olivia moved through the house, in the way Daniel responded to her without thinking, in the way decisions were made before I even realized there had been a choice to begin with. It was all there, not hidden, not disguised, just layered under years of routine that I had accepted without question. I started paying attention to the details I had once ignored, the timing of conversations, the way Olivia would redirect topics whenever finances came up, the way Daniel would become quieter, more careful, as if he had learned to avoid certain areas without ever admitting why, and the more I observed, the more I understood that this was not something they had planned all at once. It had grown gradually, step by step, until it became normal, until even I had accepted it as part of my life. That evening, I sat in the living room with a book open in my hands. Not reading, just watching. Olivia was at the kitchen counter, checking something on her tablet, her posture relaxed but focused, and Daniel was nearby, scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing up at her, waiting, always waiting. I noticed how she did not ask for his opinion. She informed him, and he agreed, not out of fear, not even out of pressure, but out of habit, and that was the difference. Habits do not feel like control, they feel like comfort, until you realize they have replaced your ability to choose. I closed the book quietly and set it aside. Daniel, I said, my voice calm, steady. He looked up immediately, but there was a slight delay before he responded, as if he was adjusting to the idea that I had spoken first. Yes, Mom, he replied. I held his gaze for a moment, not confrontational, not demanding, just present. How long have you been managing my accounts? I asked, and the room shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough for me to feel it. Olivia's hands paused for a fraction of a second before she continued what she was doing. Daniel blinked, then looked briefly toward her before answering. We have been helping for a few years now, he said, his tone measured, careful. I nodded slightly. Helping, I repeated, letting the words sit between us. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, not because of the question, but because of what it implied. You said you did not want to deal with those things anymore, he added, and I could hear it, not just the explanation, but the justification, the version of the story they had agreed on, the one that made everything seem reasonable, acceptable, even kind. I did not argue with him, I did not correct him, I simply asked another question, and the trust, I said, and this time, the reaction was clearer. Olivia looked up, her expression still composed but more alert now. Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a moment, Before he answered, "That is just part of the estate planning Dad set up," he said, and there it was again, the partial truth, the surface explanation that avoided the deeper reality. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting in my lap, relaxed, controlled. "I spoke with the bank," I said, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was charged, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with awareness, because now they understood that I had stepped outside the version of my life they had been maintaining. Olivia set her tablet down slowly, her movements deliberate. "What exactly did they tell you?" she asked, her voice calm but precise, and for the first time, I heard it clearly, not concern, not confusion, but calculation. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Enough," I replied, and I did not elaborate, I did not explain, because I did not need to. The power in that moment was not in what I said, it was in what I chose not to say. I stood up quietly and walked toward the hallway, leaving them there in the silence they could not control, and as I moved through the house, I felt something settle inside me, not tension, not uncertainty, but clarity. Because I was no longer trying to understand their actions, I already did, and I was no longer waiting for them to admit anything. I did not need them to. What I needed was already in my hands. And they were just beginning to realize that they were no longer the ones deciding what happened next. The next morning, I did not wait for anything to happen. I did not sit with my coffee and wonder what they might say or do, because I understood now that waiting had been the habit that kept me in place for so many years, and I was done with that. I called Linda as soon as the bank opened, my voice steady, clear. "I am ready to proceed with full control of all accounts and the trust," I said, and there was no hesitation on her end, no questions about whether I was sure, because she could hear it in my tone. I was not reacting anymore, I was deciding. By noon I was back in her office, documents spread out in front of me, each page representing something that had been handled without my knowledge for far too long, and, this time, I did not read them slowly. I already understood what they meant. This was about execution, not discovery. "We will need to revoke all third-party access," Linda explained, pointing to the sections that required my signature. "This includes both Daniel and Olivia." I nodded once, picking up the pen, the weight of it familiar in my hand, but the meaning behind it entirely different now. I signed the first document, then the next, and the next, each signature quiet, controlled, final. There was no anger in the motion, no hesitation, just clarity, because this was not about taking something away from them, it was about returning something to myself. Linda continued outlining the process: temporary holds, authorization changes, account restructuring, and I listened carefully, asking only the questions that mattered, not to confirm what I already knew, but to ensure that every step was complete, precise, irreversible. When we reached the trust documentation, she paused slightly. "This will shift primary control entirely to you," she said, and I met her gaze without flinching. "It already belongs to me," I replied, and for the first time, I heard the difference in my own voice. Not uncertainty, not doubt, but ownership, the kind that does not need to be proven, only exercised. It took less than an hour to complete everything, years of quiet control undone in a series of simple legal actions, no confrontation, no raised voices, just signatures and confirmations, the kind of changes that do not make noise but alter everything beneath the surface. When I left the bank, I did not feel victorious. I did not feel relieved. I felt aligned, as if something that had been out of place for a long time had finally been set correctly. I drove home at the same steady pace, the same familiar route, but this time, I was not observing, I was preparing, because I knew what would happen next, not in detail, not in words, but in reaction. Control does not disappear quietly, it resists, it questions, it tries to reestablish itself, and I was ready for that. When I walked through the front door, the house looked the same. The furniture in place, the quiet hum of routine unchanged, but I could feel the difference, not in the space, but in myself. I set my purse down and moved through the kitchen, placing my keys on the counter, my movements calm, deliberate, and then I Waited, not for long, just enough time for the first shift to reach them. It came in the form of a phone call, Olivia's voice from the other room, sharper than usual, lower, controlled, but strained. "That cannot be right," she said, and I paused. Not listening for information, but for confirmation. A few seconds later, Daniel's voice joined hers, confused, questioning, and I could hear it now, not the words, but the tone, uncertainty. The kind that comes when something you relied on suddenly no longer responds the way you expect. I did not go to them. I did not interrupt. I stayed exactly where I was, letting them come to me, because this was no longer their system to manage, it was mine, and for the first time in a very long time, I was not being guided through my own life. I was standing at the center of it, steady, quiet, and completely in control of what would happen next. They came into the kitchen together, not rushed, not loud, but unsettled in a way that was impossible to hide. Daniel's steps slower than usual, Olivia's posture still composed but tighter now, controlled in a way that suggested something had slipped just beyond her reach. I did not turn to face them immediately. I finished placing my cup in the sink, rinsed it carefully, dried my hands, and only then did I look at them, because timing matters. And I was no longer reacting to their rhythm, I was setting my own. "Mom," Daniel said first, his voice uncertain, searching for the right tone, the right words. "We just got a call from the bank." I nodded once, not surprised, not curious, just acknowledging what had already happened. Olivia stepped forward slightly, her expression measured, but there was something new beneath it now, not control, not confidence, but calculation trying to reassemble itself. "There seems to be some kind of issue with the accounts," she said, choosing her words carefully. "We were told access has been restricted." I met her gaze steadily, not confrontational, not defensive, just present. "It has been corrected," I replied, and I let the words sit there, simple, direct, complete. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion settling into his features. "Corrected," he repeated, as if the word did not fit into the situation he thought he understood. "What does that mean?" I walked past them slowly and took a seat at the table, resting my hands in front of me. Calm, grounded. "It means everything is now exactly where it should have been all along," I said, and this time, neither of them spoke immediately, because the meaning was clear even if they did not want to accept it. Olivia was the first to recover, her voice still even, but sharper now, more precise. "Margaret, we have been managing those accounts for years. There are procedures, responsibilities. You cannot just make changes without discussing them." I watched her carefully as she spoke, noting the shift. Not asking, not explaining, but asserting, as if authority could be restored simply by stating it. I shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just certain. "They were never yours to manage," I said, and the room went quiet again, not heavy, not tense, just still, the kind of stillness that comes when something undeniable has been spoken out loud. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something he had not recognized before. "We were trying to help you," he said, his voice softer now, less certain. I held his gaze, not unkind, but unwavering. "Help does not replace someone," I replied, and I saw it land, not as an argument, not as an accusation, but as truth, the kind that does not need to be proven because it is already understood. Olivia crossed her arms slightly, a small movement, but one that revealed more than her words. "You are overreacting," she said, her tone controlled but tighter now. "This is not how these things are handled." I leaned back in my chair, my posture relaxed, my voice steady. "It is exactly how they are handled when they belong to me," I said, and I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further, because I did not need to. The documents were signed. The access was changed. The structure was no longer theirs to manage, and they both knew it, even if they had not yet accepted it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times when he was younger, but now it carried something different, not frustration, not confusion, but realization, slow, quiet realization that the version of reality he had been operating in had just shifted, and he had not been the one to control it. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice lower, more careful, and I answered without hesitation, without emotion. Without pause, now everything moves forward the way it should have from the beginning, I said, and I stood up, not to leave, not to avoid, but to signal something simple and final. That the conversation was not an opening, it was a conclusion, because this was never about confrontation, it was about clarity, and now that it existed, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to negotiate, only the quiet, steady understanding that the life I had been living was no longer something I was watching from the outside. It was something I was fully, finally, and unmistakably inside of again.